starting the recording of the session. So, hello, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, and you are really, really welcome to the British Association for Psychological Types 32nd conference. And as you're all aware, it's online, and we are celebrating 100 years of type, and that is specifically celebrating the centenary of Carl Jung's writing of psychological type. And to open the conference, I am delighted to be able to introduce to you Richard Owen. And Richard is our treasurer at the British Association for Psychological Type. And I'm not going to say anything more about him because I think probably most of you are aware just how brilliant he is, and just delighted to have you opening the conference with this fascinating talk about 100 years of misunderstanding type and academia. So thank you, and over to you, Richard.
Hi, thanks everyone for coming along. Hopefully you can hear me. If you're not me or Sarah, please mute yourself using the bottom left button on the screen. I'm going to share my screen now so that we can see the slides. Hopefully, Sarah, can you see my slides? Good, excellent. Right, yeah, so keep yourself muted. Please, we're not going to have any questions during the talk, but I will stick around for a while afterwards at the end. As it says here, the bottom, I'm going to move quite fast. I like to pack in lots of ideas, and the slides have writing on them, but don't try to read it all. I've got some bits highlighted in red, which are most important. The thing is not to try and stress yourself by reading everything. The reason that I'm doing this is because there's a lot of context that you can look back on in the recording later. So when we've released the recording, you can, if you want to read all the slides, just watch it back and pause it, and then you can spend as much time as you want. So you don't feel there's any pressure to read them. So yeah, I'm right down here in Brighton on the south coast, in sunny Brighton in the UK. My type preferences are INTJ, and I've, through my educational career, got my MSc in organizational psychology, diploma in transformational coaching. I've done lots of psychometric training, like the BPS test user qualifications, and lots of different assessment tools, including the MBTI, but lots of other trait-based ones as well. So I wanted to get a really rounded background in the understanding personality from different perspectives. My most topic of most interest for me is typology, Carl Jung, and also the work of John Beebe, who's a great Jungian analyst from San Francisco, who's an author and pushing forwards a lot of the ideas in psychological type in the current time. So based on John's ideas, I've got my own model personality parts, which builds on his model, and that's kind of outside the scope of today's talk, but I do other presentations on that, as you might find on the internet. So as Sarah said, I'm the current treasurer and a trustee of the BAPT. I also run the Brighton Jungian Psychology Meetup, the local group. So it's not about my life, it's about Carl Jung's life here. I've got a very quick overview. You see some interesting pictures of Carl, the young Jung. He was born in 1875 in Switzerland, and he studied and became a psychiatrist. He became a medical doctor. He worked in the Bergolzi Institute. It's like a major mental health institute in Switzerland. Built in his career, and he came into contact with Freud, who most of you will have heard of as well, being very famous. And he got to know him, also became kind of Freud's right-hand man. But when Jung published The Psychology of the Unconscious, it was a book that really conflicted with a lot of Freud's central ideas in his theory, and they sort of had a bit of a falling out for that and other reasons. And post that period, Jung went into his, what they call the dark night of the soul, his red book period, where he went into a deep kind of exploration of his own psyche, and had some pretty incredible experiences that she documents in the Red Book and elsewhere. But then he comes out of that at the age of 45 and publishes Psychological Types, the book which has arguably brought us here today. This is the starting point. And I'm going to tell you more about that in a minute. Later on in his career, he gets into more and more sort of, you could call it esoteric sort of subjects. He gets into the archetypes, alchemy, synchronicity. He dies at the age of 85. There he is, the older kind of jolly granddad Jung, which most of us kind of know from pictures of him. But it's interesting looking at the earlier pictures of, what he would have looked like sort of around the time in the middle of his life when he published Psychological Types. And there is the sort of original book, Psychologische Typen, that's in German originally. And it was published by the Rasche Publishing House in Zurich, which was well known for publishing the authors who were pacifists. That was kind of their thing. And the English translation came 2 years later, 1923, originally by H.G. Baines, who was an associate of Jung's, and it's a different translation to the one in the collected works. There's subtle differences in the way the words have been translated. I'm lucky enough to own a copy of it, of the H.G. Baines translation. It's worth remembering that there's two versions, and sometimes you can get a clearer idea of what Jung meant by looking at both different ones and seeing how it might be interpreted in different ways. It's really nice to look at this little story here about, apparently at the time when he was writing Psychological Types, he was feeling pressure to get all these ideas out and publish them. But he was really busy with patients. And under all this pressure, he came down with a bout of whooping cough, which apparently affects you during the night, but not during the day. So during the night, he was coughing. In the daytime, he found a secretary who had already had whooping cough and was immune to it. And he dictated the book to her. He dictated 583 pages within 6 weeks of quarantine. Now, it's interesting that when you read the book, it's got this kind of stream of consciousness style. It's quite hard to read. I think this is part of why it has that, because he dictated it. He literally was speaking it out as he went. So the book, Psychological Types, the core of it really is about the problem of opposites, which you could call like polarized viewpoints on the world, which ultimately are underpinned by dynamics in the mind or the psyche. He talks about a one-sided orientation of consciousness, like that which we are aware of. And the habitual attitude, we'll look at more about the word attitude later, is what he defined as what a type is. It's a habitual one-sidedness. But it's important that we have the compensating unconscious aspect of the mind, which is always there as well in compensation. And you could call this theory about what I term the relativity of reality, that by having a one-sided consciousness like orientation on reality, reality itself becomes relative to your position from which you're viewing it. So not any kind of knowledge, or how we see theories of science, or how people perceive what God is like, that all these different things that are covered in the book, in the fact that because of the personal equation, this individual subjective viewpoint that we have, we see the world from a different lens from other people. And Jung developed this theory from 20 years of therapeutic practice, working with clients, but also from correspondence with his colleagues, with others, with letters, with great thinkers of the time, and also through his own self-exploration. It's really key that phenomenological exploration of the inner world, of the mind from within, is a real underpinning of Jung's work. So here's some of the chapters 1 to 9. This is kind of the bulk of the book. And as Steve Myers says in his book, these chapters 1 to 9 contain the bulk of Jung's theory, but they're not reader-friendly. They take the form of a literature review, examining in chronological order how earlier philosophers, psychologists, or poets even dealt with the problem of one-sidedness. So he's doing this historical review of how people found this phenomena of one-sidedness and portrayed it in different ways in literature. So within those 9 chapters, Jung weaves his understanding of the problem of one-sidedness and its solution, which is really crucial, the solution of the symbol of the transcendent function and of overcoming one-sidedness, finding a greater viewpoint that encompasses both. He talks about his theory, his concept of introversion and extroversion, which he created the terms for. So actually Jung's theory of introversion, extroversion, it's about a dynamic relationship between the subject, which is the experiencing aspect of the mind that is doing the experiencing, and the object, the thing which is being experienced. This is like a philosophical position of subject-object dualism. And it's practical because there is a subjective experience which only we have and other people can't access. So the arrows show that they're mechanisms. He calls introversion and extroversion mechanisms. And there's always both mechanisms, like the movement of energy, as he called it, or interest and attention towards either the object for extroversion or the subject for introversion. And you can see the solid arrow in these is the attitude, the fact that there's a priority in extroversion towards the objective view, objective conditions, and in introversion towards the subjective. So despite any other definitions of introversion and extroversion you may think of, then this is actually the core of Jung's actual concept. It's a psychodynamic concept. And this is from a diagram in a book by Marie-Louise von France, who's a great analyst. It's a great analyst. So Jung says that everybody possesses both mechanisms, extroversion as well as introversion. Only the relative predominance of one or the other determines the type. There can never be a pure type in the sense that it possesses only one mechanism with the complete atrophy of the other. Then we've got chapters 10 and 11, which come near the end of the book, and they're in a very different style. You know, he's got this rambling prose, this weaving of like going off on tangents and long discursions in chapters 1 to 9. And chapters 10 and 11 are much more concise and organized and structured and short, relatively. There's an interesting theory by the author Nan Savage Healy, who wrote about Jung and Tony Wolff and their relationship. And she puts forward that did Tony Wolff actually write or maybe just rework chapters 10 and 11? It's an interesting idea because they're so different to the rest of the book. It's possible, entirely possible, I think, that she had a hand, someone had a hand in it. It's interesting that Jung later then describes these descriptions as somewhat terse, like as in kind of too kind of abrupt. He kind of, they didn't fit his more rambling style. And I think, you know, he maybe disagreed with the way they were reworked, but they were very impactful because a lot of people can only understand those chapters and actually take that from those ideas in that, only in those chapters, what they know about psychological types. And yet Jung says far too many readers have succumbed to the error of thinking that chapter 10 represents the essential content and purpose of the book. He actually says classification is nothing but a childish parlor game, and his typologies are rather a critical apparatus serving to sort out and organize the welter of empirical material, but not in any sense to stick labels on people at first sight. It's a critical psychology dealing with the organization and delimitation of psychic processes, that's psychological processes, that can be shown to be typical. These are forewords that he wrote in later versions of the book, which you can find in the collected works. He says, for this reason, I've placed the general typology and definitions at the end of the book, going to hid them away. After having described in chapters 1 to 9 the processes in question with the help of various examples. He said, I therefore recommend the reader who really wants to understand my book to immerse himself first of all in chapters 2 and 5. And they're chapters which are, again, sort of like they metaphorically pose the issue and the solution within kind of a literature review of different previous authors. He says it will gain more than from any typological terminology superficially picked up, since it serves no purpose other than a totally useless desire to stick on labels. I'd recommend David Poole's talk tomorrow. He's going to be looking at chapter 2, which is Schiller's ideas on type. That's at the BAPT conference. Crucially, let's look at the term attitude, because a lot of people think, oh, it means introversion and extroversion. People think, oh, they are the attitudes. And by the way Jung writes about it, sometimes you would think that's what he means, but if you look at the definition of attitude, which he says the definitions always take precedence, you realize that there's something much broader to the term attitude. He says it's a readiness of the psyche to act or react in a certain way. It's like an underlying disposition. It's an a priori orientation that's there before. You don't create it. A selection or a judgment takes place which excludes anything irrelevant. The selection is implicit in the attitude and takes place automatically. He says it's an automatic phenomenon. This is really crucial because like type is not a choice. It's something which kind of happens and then you have to witness that it is happening and become aware of it. He says it's an essential cause of the one-sidedness. As we said, attitude is about attention, interest, and value getting automatically drawn in one direction and not away from others. And Jung talks about many types of typology, many types of attitude, not just the ones in typology. Attitude's a much broader topic that covers like political attitudes, for instance. And you notice it because people come to like almost unreconcilable disagreements because their viewpoint, their perspective and reality is grounded in a certain different lens to the other person's, and therefore they just cannot see eye to eye. And we see it all the time in the world around us. MBTI idea of preference or handedness is similar, to, I think, to what he's talking about in terms of attitude, in what attitude is about. So just on the red bits here, he's also saying that there's a typical thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuitive attitude. Attitude is not just to do with introversion, extroversion, it's to do with the functions. Any kind of underlying one-sided pull is an attitude. And an attitude is more like a state concept. In the moment, you get polarized, but then it becomes habitual over time. That becomes the type. He says there are social attitudes as well, characterized by various isms. You've heard of things like rationalism, realism, idealism, a lot of things that philosophers covered, and realized that they had just different perspectives on reality. That's the whole discussion of philosophy is trying to come to terms with how people see the world in different ways. So it's a broad topic, the idea of attitude, much broader than people think. In chapter 10, here's the actual contents of it. You can see how he breaks it down really in these two sections. You've got the extroverted type and the introverted type. He even talks about the peculiarities of the basic psychological functions in the extroverted attitude or in the introverted attitude. So, you know, he does talk about basic functions that become then expressed in introverted or extroverted attitudes. The way he's using the term, sometimes it confuses you compared to what we've just seen from his description. And then he breaks down into the 8, what some people have now called function attitudes. So this is kind of the structure. You know, you've got introversion, extroversion, and you've got the thinking, feeling, sensing, intuition, which are the basic functions. And they, you know, in this sort of way of thinking, these are like the components, and they come together to give you, they combine to give you these 8 types, which he has an 8-type system in the book. He doesn't really go into an 8 to 16 type system. Well, not properly. He kind of alludes to it, you know, near the end and starts describing it a little bit. But these are the core types, these 8, and they're really functions or mental areas of mental processing. And you become a type because your consciousness becomes orientated by this underlying attitude towards prioritizing one of these as your main lens on reality. But then he says in practice, these 4 types are always combined with the attitude types. This is from 1936, a bit later. Always combined with extroversion or introversion, so that functions appear in the introverted or extroverted variation. This produces a set of 8 demonstrable function types. In practice means that any time you actually observe people or externally or within the mind itself in a state, in the moment, you don't actually experience extroversion, introversion, or the thinking, feeling, sensing, intuition. So this kind of flips it around. I believe, this is my point, that this is a key misunderstanding fundamentally that Jung kind of made himself, but then you kind of realize later on that actually, rather than these being like components or antecedents, rather than introversion, extroversion, and the basic functions existing in their own right and then combining together to give you these 8 functions. Actually, it's the other way around. It's a complete flip. That actually these are the actual fundamental components of state experience, the 8 types, 8 functions of consciousness. And the ones at the top, are actually abstractions of them. They're abstractions, they're qualities which they have and share in common. It's a complete flip around. And unfortunately, it's means it's a little bit unfortunate that we've mainly gone down the road of using the components, the abstracted components. Here's a sort of analogy of abstraction. Here's a kind of bar, a tasty cake. You imagine, like, if this represents you as a person and your personality, and imagine that, like, you go through life and each moment of life is like a little nibble of the cake, and because of the way that the components, the ingredients are spread throughout the cake, in each nibble of time, in reality, you get a little different sort of taste of different ingredients, different parts that, different aspects of us show up at different times. But, there's fundamentally this core, like, ingredients, like, within that cake. But then there's the abstract level, which is like the nutritional information. When you abstract, you say fat, 11 grams, but that's an abstraction that actually the fat only exists in reality within the ingredients, within actual different forms, and the fat that's within sultanas is different to the fat that's within the Brazil nuts, for instance, within the cake. But the abstracted view takes a quality and sucks it out of the things and separates reality in a way that isn't naturally separated on the level of actual experience. And that's, I think, the analogy for what's happening with type. We have to understand what abstraction is, and that when we're dealing with something that is abstracted, it's not the same as dealing with the direct experience in the moment. So some more examples of what Jung was talking about. He says no individual is simply introverted or extroverted, but he is so in one of his functions. And that's why I mention these function types here, because in individual cases, the introverted and extroverted attitudes can never be demonstrated per se. They appear only as the peculiarity of the predominating conscious function. He's saying you can't separate introversion and extroversion from the functions. They're always tied up. You have 4 types of introversion. You have 4 introverted functions. But introversion itself is just an abstraction that they have in common. It's a quality that they share in common. But it only manifests in those particular forms. Strictly speaking, there are no introverts or extroverts, pure and simple. Only introverted and extroverted function types, such as thinking, sensation, etc. There's at least 8 clearly distinguishable types. In describing the introvert, I like this one. Jung cautioned that the type of which he was about to speak, the introvert, was not a human being, but an abstraction which could not physically exist. I speak of the extracts we should get if you put 10,000 introverts into a retort, presumably boiled them and extracted their introversion. This is from a 1935 lecture. Sonno Shamdasani is a great Jungian scholar, and he's going to publish books on the ETH lectures in the next few years. The type lectures will come out, and we'll hear some of Jung's words that he's never said, and this is part of it. And that's so they've never been published before. So he's saying, he warns them against identification. He's saying we shouldn't say, are you an introvert or an extrovert? Because it's like, in his terms, the types are like, well, are you an introverted intuitive, or are you an introverted feeling type, or are you thinking, or whatever? It's the point is it's always tied to the function. But actually, that's what the Myers-Briggs model kind of gets to in the end. But it takes the abstracted component model, the dichotomies that they have, the pairs of preferences, sorry, and then it kind of, you can decode that to get to this model based on the 8 functions, the 8 processes. But I'm saying it's kind of I think it's a costly misunderstanding, because anyone that works with the Myers-Briggs starts to realize that, like, when you do start to talk about, say, introversion, extroversion as an abstracted thing, it gets a bit tenuous for people quite quickly. But when you start actually describing the 8 functions, the 4 different types of introversion, 4 different types of extroversion, And you do it in the way Jung's saying, you tie it, and you start talking about the level of experience of the 8 functions. It starts making a lot more sense to people. So working at an abstract level can cause problems. I'm saying the 8 function level more closely reflects experienced states in the moment. We can recognize introverted intuition. It's very different to introverted feeling or introverted thinking or introverted sensing. So Steve Myers, I mentioned him before. He's a British Jungian scholar, and he wrote this book, which is Myers-Briggs typology versus Jungian individuation. And it's interesting because it kind of proposes another misunderstanding that came the stage between Jung and the MBTI, which is that he says what's missing from Myers-Briggs typology is the stage beyond type that Isabel Briggs-Myers acknowledged was possible, but he saw no need for. He says this is the gravamen of Jung's theory. It's like a central argument to Jung's theory. And this point is individuation. It's the transcending of the opposites. It's basically like he's saying that like we do become one-sided. It's part of a stepping stone on the journey, but ultimately the mind is trying to reconcile. And there's this idea of the transcendent function by which the unconscious mind can produce symbols that allow us to integrate psychologically the opposites and the tensions that are within the one-sidedness. He says individuation is a dialectical process, this negotiation in which the individuals forms between the opposites rather than identifying with one of them. So he's making this point that actually the Myers-Briggs theory is more about he's saying it's acknowledged the presence of the unconscious. She viewed the problem as a need for balance in consciousness, which the second auxiliary function provides. And as a result, that's kind of good enough for balance to be a functioning human being. You know, as a result, we can regard being a type as a virtue, and we can stay one type throughout our personal development. For Jung, being a type is a problem because it sustains the split between the conscious and the unconscious. The whole point of his book, the gravamen, as Steve puts it, is that Jung was trying to find a way to help people transcend type, ultimately. Steve's book, by the way, his Appendix B in there is a brilliant summary of the book Psychological Types. You know, I've read Psychological Types twice. I've spent years studying it, but like, if you just want a very quick overview of the key points, paraphrased in a way that's understandable, I think you can't go far wrong from Steve's book, which is this one, Myers-Briggs Typology versus Jungian Individuation. So some reviews. So what happened when Jung published Psychological Types in English in 1923? Sonia Shamdasani writes about this. The New York Times, they seem to like it. Splendid and great contribution to psychology. Bravo, well done. But there's slight differences of opinion. You've got in something called the New Republic, you've got John Watson, and we'll talk more about him in a minute. And he took Jung to task for ignoring nearly all of 20th century psychology, which I guess only part of it happened at that point. He says one cannot go into criticism of Jung's psychology, the kind the religious mystic must write in order to find justification for certain factors in his training, as his training has forced him to believe must exist. Jung's stress on the innateness of typology evoked Watson's scorn, and far from aiding psychology, it confuses it with unjustifiable and unsupported assumptions. It seems to be but another justification of life's failures and to give one more shoulder upon which the weakling may lean. That's pretty harsh. Not a very nice review. I wouldn't want a review like that. But it's interesting that this quite harsh critical perspective, you start seeing it resonating over the years, and there's other people who are a bit like John Watson and think in his kind of way. There he is there. He's actually probably one of a couple of key figures in the movement of behaviorism, which shaped psychology unrecognizably, like completely in the 20th century. He wrote this book, Psychology as the Behaviorist Views It, which is essentially a manifesto for behaviorism. He says behaviorism. It's a purely objective experimental branch of natural science. Its theoretical goal is the prediction and control of behavior. Introspection forms no essential part of its method. Introspection was really a key part of like Jung's analytical psychology and his work with patients. It's about helping people explore their mind from the inside out. You know, that was kind of so. But then Jung's discarding introspection. Watson's discarding introspection. He says the time has come when psychology must discard all references to consciousness. Well, Jung's typology was about one-sidedness of consciousness. So you discard consciousness, you're not ever going to understand it. It need no longer delude itself into thinking that it's making mental states the object of observation. You know, it's a big thing. It's a big shift in psychology to get away from mental states, mental processes, the mind. You know, it sends psychology into a totally different direction. Varela has written about behaviorism, particularly compatible with this early 20th century positivist zeitgeist, this worldview of disembodied objectivism, that we have to see everything from the outside, like that's what science needs to do, not from the inside. It eliminated mind entirely from its psychology. What a thing to do! Like, you know, it's like for me, it's like eliminating atoms from chemistry. It's crazy, but that's what happened. You know, to a degree that it took a radical shift. And behaviorism completely dominated North American experimental psychology from the 20s until the 90s and even beyond. Its repercussions globally into what we now see as psychology have had huge repercussions. But it was partly a reaction to structuralism and introspectionism in the 19th century and early 20th century, where there was problems in exploring the mind from the inside because people didn't agree. But then that's the whole point that Jung's saying, that people's conscious perspective is different, so they're not going to agree. Oh well. Here's some key differences on what we now see in, you know, people who would criticize type, and mainstream psychology tends to follow trait views of personality. And I'll contrast it with type. So some reasons why they're different ways of looking at personality, and they're different paradigms are based in some of these areas. You know, trait psychology was developed by predominantly US and UK based psychologists in sort of academic psychology. Type was developed by Swiss psychotherapists coming from a completely different world, looking at things in a totally different way. You know, psychotherapy and psychology.
Richard, I think you muted yourself. Can't hear you.
Someone muted me, thank you. Yeah, if you mute all, Sarah, you mute me too. Sorry about that. I don't know where you got to. I was saying about this, psychologists and psychotherapists, different background. Psycholexical theory is based on taking words from the dictionary, and then there's this hypothesis, the lexical hypothesis, that says all those words naturally reflect everything we need to know about personality. It just happens to have evolved that way. Whereas the psychodynamic view, it doesn't start with words and then analyzing them with statistics. It starts with an experiential systems model of the mind, looking at different components in a dynamic system and how they interact and what are the relationships between them. You know, trait looks at statistical patterns within these words and how people tend to rate themselves and quantify themselves on them. The trait way tends to focus on behavioral, what we are doing, like what we're expressing. The type way, it's more about phenomenological exploration, like what is the experience of aspects of the mind as a subject, as we are experiencing them. That's the grounding of it ultimately. Because type as a phenomenon, this attitude, this disposition, it's something that is within the system of the mind. And actually, this is the problem, is that you can't really get to grips with it without looking inside and without asking these questions. you can't see it from outside. You can see clues, but people might not be following that disposition for various reasons. There's the argument of, like, both sides actually claim to be based in being empirical. That is based on observation and experience of reality. Jung writes this many times, that everything he came up with was based on his observations and what people told him about themselves in hours and hours of exploring their inner worlds in analysis. But trait psychologists pride themselves in being empirical. It's interesting, though, that the psycholexical background isn't really based in observing behavior and then categorizing it. It's based in a kind of a logical assumption, taking the words from the dictionary. It's secondarily empirical in that then the research gets people to quantify themselves or others in these traits. But they tend to conflate the word empirical, not just about based in observation and experience, but with the entire methodology of modern psychology. When people use the word empirical, they often say, oh, this is not empirical. They don't mean it wasn't based on observation. They mean it wasn't based on observation, and it wasn't systematic, and it wasn't statistical, and it wasn't quantitative, and it wasn't a whole host of other things which they've all compiled together. This entire way of doing science, approaching experiments, that seems to have been conflated into the word empirical, when actually it means one specific thing. When you take it in that way, actually Jung was right. Yes, I mean, he was careful not to make massive assumptions. He did ground it in what he observed. Traits tends to be quantitative. It's about this idea of how much of something is there. But types are more about qualitative. It's like, what do you what feels natural to you? What do you prefer? There's the normative, like taking traits and measuring, quantifying, but then comparing it to sample, like a population, and saying, okay, well, you there's an average, there's a mean to this distribution of the trait, and then like compared to the population, you're relatively high, or you're relatively low, or whatever, or about average. And ipsative is more of a question of it's like kind of choosing between different things, like which one is above the other one, which one do you prefer, which one's more natural. And there are in modern day, there are both normative and ipsative types of questionnaires, and the MBTI is an ipsative questionnaire, and the implications of that don't seem to be kind of taken into consideration when it's criticized. Trait tends to look at what's expressed, but also a bit of what's dispositional. It sort of implies what's underlying that expression. Type is really, for me, it's all about the disposition. It's about that attitude underlying. It's not about the environmental forces or the conscious choice, although those do affect how you behave. It's about getting to the core of, well, where's that like bias in my mind, where's it naturally gravitating me to. Traits tend to be like current snapshot, like this is like a profile of expression of me now, of how much of these things I'm expressing. Whereas type is more about, for me, it's a developmental context. It's about looking at how your mind has kind of, it's not just a snapshot of now, but it's looking at how over the whole period of your entire life, especially your younger development years, there was this bias pulling your mind towards certain perspective and certain ways of processing. So the idea of root metaphors, I'm not sure if Julie Benesh is here on this call, but I'd like to thank her for corresponding with me by email. She's from the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, and it's nice to meet academics who kind of get this stuff, who understand that there's this different level of looking at these misunderstandings where you can start to kind of bridge the perspectives between type and trait that seem to have fallen out of favor. She put me onto the work of Pepper, who wrote about world hypotheses. She's run a class putting forward an idea that like type was based on formist worldviews, like the idea that of looking at things as classes or categories based on similarity. She was also suggesting that like trait was more from a mechanistic worldview, machine divisible into interacting parts. I think like broadly, there's a lot of modern science which it's got this machine metaphor behind it. My thoughts are actually, if I was asking what are the root metaphors. So for trait, the root metaphor is a measuring tape. And you hear people saying this, well, my assessment is just like a measuring tape. But there's something quite funny about that as an analogy. All analogies break quite quickly when you really analyze them. And the idea is that in saying that like, it's saying that traits are like physical objects. And in a sense, the distribution of them when you measure them form a norm curve, like height and weight and physical traits. In that way, they're kind of similar, but they're psychological constructs, they're abstract ideas, they're not physical objects. And trying to treat them as such, for me, it's a bit of like what I call pseudo-physicalism, pseudo-materialism. It's like conflating them as something by analogy, which they're really not. And trait questionnaires are only a little bit like a tape measure by analogy, but that quite breaks down. Type, the root metaphor is handedness. It's like, you know, MBTI cleverly uses that as the metaphor. You know, which one do we prefer? Which one's natural to us? Another thing I'd say is that there's kind of an introverted by Jung's theory. Remember that like extroversion is the prioritization of the external objective viewpoint. But the trait view, like it tends to take that, as we've talked about, it tends to like to be objective and look at things in the external world. And even in that model, in the big five, extroversion is the trait. Introversion kind of is like it's in some ways it's like a deficit of extroversion. It doesn't have its own special place, although what we call introversion does appear in different facets of traits, but there's a kind of extroverted introverted split of worldview, but because the subjective view of the mind from within is like what type's grounded in, the introverted perspective. So there's an extroverted introverted perspective split between trait and type. You could call that like an objectivist subjectivist kind of split of perspective. This is kind of view of like the trait model. Like I said, there's like thousands of trait adjectives, words that describe people. You pull them out of the dictionary, you run factor analysis like after people have quantified themselves on the traits. And then they find that it starts to, they kind of whittle it down. They find the abstract qualities which clumps or groups of those words and traits have in common. And they find that they kind of form like a hierarchy that you can start to see statistically. So you get 30 facets that come out of these thousands of traits. You get 10 aspects from the 30 facets. You get the big five abstract domains. Yeah, these are abstract descriptive domains of qualities in which you can describe human beings. But they are distillations, like Jung was talking about, like putting things in a retort and boiling them down. They're distillations of the meaning that thousands of words have in common. But obviously you do lose some of the nuance by doing this, by boiling things down. There's this interesting level at the top, stability, plasticity. It's a bit like the yin and yang of personality, like the order and chaos. It's really interesting studying trait psychology. But it's interesting, often it's drawn in this way with the arrows going down, but remember, actually they should be flipped because it's really, these are like increasing in abstraction going upwards. This is the highest level of abstraction of the personality model of the traits. So when psychologists have written about the big five, which is, and this is the sort of the leading trait model, and there's handbooks, like textbooks on the subject. For instance, here they're saying that the big five provides a descriptive taxonomy. It's a descriptive model that organizes the myriad natural language and scientific trait concepts into a single classificatory framework. It was never intended as a comprehensive personality theory. It's account for structural relations among personality traits. So it's trait models. The big five is about qualities with which you can describe people. And also, the studies of trait psychology, they don't address the causality or underlying mechanisms of behavior. It's primarily the language. It's really about, well, what is expressed? How do you quantify it? And then how do you then use that to predict things as one of the key ways of using it? But there's a secondary meaning of personality traits. It's about describing the functional level of underlying psychological processes. There's an implication that traits, the descriptive expression of our behavior, has an underlying set of mental things, like mental process model behind it. And it was Jung created a mental process model, which, as we know, works pretty well for a lot of people. It's interesting that modern psychology doesn't seem to have an actual model of, in the way that Jung was doing, of mental processes. I think the two can work together. We can see that if there's an implication that psychological processes are responsible for what happens at then what you see as the behavioral level, you could arguably say that like type can be brought back into this model and shown that it's part of the building a more of a psychological process model. Again, this is my traits profile. It's interesting that you can see how type and trait work together. Like, it's an INTJ, right? You'd expect, well, my intuition is my leading thing. Like we know from traits that openness to experience tends to correlate with intuition. You can see that even now, like in my 40s when I did this, you've got this, I'm expressing a lot of openness to experience. I'm also expressing a lot of conscientiousness, which will correlate with like the extroverted thinking, which is my second auxiliary function. You can see like, my feeling, the agreeableness is I've always had this underlying disposition, but it's not bad. I'm kind of average on feeling expression. It's there because, by this point in my life, I've developed it a bit. When I was younger, it would have been much lower down for these areas. Extroversion, again, I'm an introverted. My dominant function is an introverted process. So most areas of extroversion, I'm expressing quite low, but apart from assertiveness, still got that, a bit of warmth. So let's talk about a century of branches. Jung's original writings, we've talked a bit about those, but over this 100 years, we've got post-Jungians like von Franz, James Hillman, Angelo Spoto, John Beebe, etc. People who've also then developed the ideas and written about them. You've got, in the 1940s, the MBTI and the official theory and materials that came from that. You've got academic research articles in mainstream journals, and those which are in the mainstream journals, but also with this CAPT library as well. Then you've got people like yourselves, a lot of people here who are practitioners who've made publications and made books about type. And then you've got socionics, which is like Jungian typology's Russian sort of cousin. And then you've got what I call #MBTI, which is the enthusiasts, the blogs, the movement on social media and the internet, free tests and all these blogs and things. Do see Theresa Moon's talk on Saturday, where she goes into investigating that world of #MBTI, of the online world. So it's interesting that for people critiquing type today, it's not just about, they may only see this bit at the end. They may only see stuff that they cursory, their cursory glances on the internet reveal to them. They may not see any of these other areas. They probably definitely don't go back to Jung's original writings or any of these other levels. Sometimes, obviously, the academics go back to academic research articles, but sometimes they only present like one side of the argument. They don't. The MBTI's got like over 50, 60 years of research articles out there on the internet. It's second only in quantity to those of like the NEO, which is the main big five instrument. And not all of it's bad. There's a lot of interesting supportive research out there. but hashtag MBTI, this is what it's become reduced to on one level, just pulled this off the internet because it looks amusing, but people like to entertain themselves, but this is a million miles away from ISTJ celery, uniform, unbendable, and properly green. Well, it makes you smirk a little bit, but at the end of the day, it really is like getting a long way from Jung's very serious, like an in-depth psychology perspective. So where are we now? I mean, we've got 60 years of MBTI research saying there's a lot of criticism, some pretty harsh criticism. You can see like it also, starting with like John Watson, there's a lot of people who were so influenced by that behaviorist movement in psychology that it's become embedded in the culture of it. And there isn't really a philosophy of science viewpoint currently, which allows people to step back and see, well, are we taking a one-sided philosophical viewpoint towards psychology? And that's what we need. We need to go back to the philosophy of science and how we perceive the world, and ultimately how that can relate to our own subjective psychology, because no one can see anything apart from through their own subjective viewpoint. They can try to take on other people's, but ultimately we experience the world from our perspective. We've got social media today. You can't argue that, you can't go against the idea that it's had a huge impact on the world around us. Anyone can now self-publish their unedited thoughts to large numbers of people. That's a complete shift from publishing like 100 years ago. And we see how that affects the world around us, like algorithms built into Facebook and other platforms. They reinforce extreme viewpoints. They send people more of what they like. It's like this. It's like a global computer system that is now compounding what Jung was talking about in attitude of one-sidedness. Because you've now got a system that's also filtering and magnifying that effect. So if somebody's already got an underlying kind of shift in their worldview, it's quite dangerous that you've got a system that like increases that. You've got frequent articles and posts that incite impassioned negativity towards the MBTI. I'd call it extremism. People are getting radicalized out there, often by stuff that is increasingly one-sided and prejudiced, and often not based in very good, balanced critique. It's often ignoring the other sides of the argument. There's this one example here, on a LinkedIn post, a Canadian, he's got a PhD, he's an industrial organizational psychologist. He's going out there in public and he's saying, I despise the MBTI. That's a pretty hard comment from someone who's a scientist. Like, science isn't really based in despising things, is it? That's a very extreme viewpoint. He's saying it isn't reliable, therefore it cannot be valid. That's buying into a common narrative that's out there. But there's lots of arguments for the reliability of the MBTI. You can look at the official literature. But these people feel that they're doing a good thing. They're on a crusade. They're not, don't have bad intentions. They think they're doing the right thing, but I think they don't realize they're coming from a viewpoint that is so one-sided, and it misses that, what Jung would talk about, the transcendent attitude, the reconciling of different viewpoints. These are highly educated people. Here you've got one of the earliest criticisms I could have found in the record was from 1962. And actually that was the year when this company ETS, who also do the SATs in the States, they signed a contract with Isabel Briggs Myers to publish the MBTI. They were like the first big publisher of it. But against the objections of some of the staff, as it's kind of documented. There was psychologists within that company publishing it that didn't like it, and they published this article critiquing it, which was quite harsh. And again, and then they made what I think is one of the common misunderstandings, the assumption that the MBTI should show by modality, that you should get 2 peaks. You would expect 2 peaks if your questionnaire was quantifying things and measuring how much of something there was. But remember, the MBTI is ipsative. It's about sorting people into what they prefer, like, and what's most important to them. So I think a lot of that argument, it doesn't make a lot of sense. They're saying Jung's if their findings imply that Jung's typology is not consistent with the real world, or the indicator does not correspond to the theoretical formulation of the typology. Well, we know that like Myers-Briggs theory of the type did diverge quite a lot from Jung's. We've already seen that in some things I presented today. But I don't think they quite understood what Jung's original typology actually was, because as we've said, it's hard to grasp from his book, even if you read Psychological Types. It's hard to get what he was even trying to say. This is one of the biggest articles of recent years. This is a pair of social psychologists, or at least one of them is. It's in a social psychology journal. It's interesting that social psychology, of all areas of psychology, is interesting because it used to like completely disagree that personality existed at all. Like years ago, there was this argument that because it was so focused on social constructivism, that who we are is basically we're a bit like blank slate theory, that we're kind of there to be shaped by the groups and the people and the social groups that we interact with. But it's not surprising that they would have an issue with type, because type, it talks about this internal disposition, which is something that comes from within the system of the mind, and this autonomy of the mind is something that makes some people a bit uncomfortable. But Jung's model was really grounded in that, in the psyche as a system that expresses itself. There's something deterministic about that some people really react against. In this article, they misattribute some ideas from the MBTI back to Jung, which is a common misunderstanding. Really, I see this as a hatchet job. Like, this was set up, and it's been said to me in private that by people in circles, of psychological circles, that they kind of had the word that there was some words, some little nods and winks, to these people that set out to destroy and discredit the MBTI. In this article they write, they want to teach how to distinguish valid science from pseudo-scientific woo. In a scientific journal, how could this get past the the editors and the peers? Like, do you not think you should maybe remove the word woo? What do you mean by woo? Like, what are you trying to get at? That's interesting. Are you an ideological quest against woo? Are you maybe a little bit one-sided? Have you got a bit of an attitude that's something you're projecting onto people who you call the woo people? Who are these woo people? It's like, this is like what Jung was talking about, like one-sidedness in science, because people have got underlying viewpoints. We would know in typology, like, I'll leave it up to you, think about it. What group of people might think there's another group of people who are a bit wacky and mystical and woo. Think about it. The article also disingenuously claims to apply the principle of charity. It's not really being nice at all. It pretends to be nice, but it's not. But it's quite a sinister paper, because it aims to invalidate the whole underlying theory. A lot of previous papers attacked kind of psychometric credentials and statistics to do with the MBTI assessment itself. This one goes to a level where it's trying to make the entire theory of typology unacceptable, and then therefore make everything else difficult to interpret. And it's interesting that they have got some points. Actually, the points they make can actually be taken and used to create a much more a newer, redeveloped version of typological theory. And I think that's something I'm going to take into my work. But it's definitely prejudiced, and it sets out to find problems and to deliberately discredit, rather than having an actual balanced critique. They have an issue with the idea of an unconscious true self. They really go on about this throughout the paper, and again, it's part of this, this viewpoint that, like, it's like, where is reality based? Is reality based in this objective view from the outside, or is it with the mind from the inside? Do we give value to, if something, we can recognize something that's true, that we didn't choose, that is just there, for me, that internal exploration is so valuable. That's what type's about. So I'm not going to go into the details of that because we're just about out of time. I've got just a couple more slides. This is another thing that came out recently in the last month or so too. It's not an academic paper. It's in a sort of blog post magazine thing. But there's a lot of this around. You know, there's scientists who are they're putting forward their positions and their worldviews, but not in academic journals and things. It's just put out in blogs, and it seems to be how science is done now. Like this, it's almost like politics. It's like propaganda, you know. And these things, these narratives, can take shape that then somehow become apparently the generally understood consensus worldview of psychologists. It's quite a dangerous thing, you know, because there isn't any sort of balanced like editing or critique of these things. It's just people can just spill their mind out onto the internet. In this, he says, any psychologist worth their salt will tell you it's mostly bullshit. I don't think that's true. I mean, any psychologist worth their salt wouldn't use the word bullshit. They wouldn't go around calling things bullshit for a start. And they wouldn't dismiss entire theories with 100 years worth of history out of hand like this. You know, they probably wouldn't have, even any psychologist with their salt probably wouldn't have a viewpoint on anything without actually investigating it in depth. They wouldn't venture to outright say anything without actually investigating it and looking at the sources. But anyway, you know, there's some points that they make in this. I'm going to quickly go over a few, just in a couple of minutes. No, again, it's just like John Watson. It's dismissing Carl Jung altogether for being mystical and supernatural, empirically unsubstantiated. And we've covered a lot of that. You know, for me, it's a breath of fresh air that Jung addressed things which are there. People have mystical, like supernatural thoughts and experiences and ideas. You know, he's not saying he doesn't justify them. He's looking at them psychologically and trying to understand why they're there and what do they mean. You know, saying it lacks predictive validity. I mean, we could go on about this forever, but you know, type influences behavior, but it's not behavior. If you've got a trait measure that measures and quantifies actual behavior, of course it's going to predict things well, because the behavior is exactly what you're looking for at the end of the day. The behavior is the direct thing which causes the thing that you're trying to predict. But type's more subtle than that. They're talking about personality is these continuous dimensions. Well, it is if you look at it like that, but really personality is individual differences. You can look at it as quantified amounts of things, or you can look at it as which one do I prefer? You can look at it ipsatively. You can look at it many ways, but the fact that personality has to be one way is a bit of a bizarre notion to me. Why should we have one way of looking at anything? Then they talk about arbitrary boundaries, that it almost like they're suggesting the MBTI is a quantified measure that then they're cutting at an arbitrary point. It isn't. I think they're looking at other questionnaires, like free questionnaires they see on the internet. Actually, looking at the MBTI manual shows that this isn't true. It's got poor reliability. Well, again, you know, most of the things that they cite about that is like decades old and doesn't look at the actual modern instrument at all. They're saying you throw away type, throw away information when you look at type. For me, it's a different kind of complementary information. If you have a trait profile and you know this is what you're expressing in your behavior, I think type adds to that. If you use them together, you can say, okay, yes, this is what you're doing, but how is that for you? Does it feel natural? Are you actually struggling with it? Are you having to fight against an underlying disposition to do that? Or are you kind of in the flow of something and following it? The MBTI doesn't measure neuroticism. Well, actually it did, like in the 1987 Form J, there was comfort scales that basically did measure something similar to neuroticism. And step 3 does as well, like the clinical sort of angled version of MBTI. They didn't know that because they never did the research on what the MBTI's history was, but it was deliberately decided not to have that because they didn't want it to be like a pathological measure, or one that seemed that way. Then there's the great one, horoscopes, Barnum, confirmation bias. Like, you know, you're all deluded fools. Like, you know, you can't trust people to take like a model of human reality and you look at your actual reality internally and match the two and decide whether they match or not. Or if you think they do, then you must be somehow deluded. It's very sinister. It's actually called, well, it's called gaslighting. If you're trying to persuade someone that their reality is wrong and they're going mad, that's gaslighting. That's the definition of what it is. You know, then they're saying misinformed decisions using type can cause harm. It can, and there are people who misuse type and use it badly and use it to make selection decisions, all kinds of things it's not supposed to be for. You should use it to understand yourself and to understand your relationships with other people. Ads, money, you know, then they're saying, but the Myers-Briggs, it's all about them making money. It's not. Most people involved in MBTI just want to help people and they want to understand themselves and to reduce conflict. There are things out there, like thanks to John Haxton and Penny Moyle, but there's not enough of this stuff. There's not enough balanced arguments. So if you're a budding scientist, you know, go out there and just help bring some transcendence to this one-sidedness, please. And you know, it's a funny situation we've got into. Be interested to see what other people at this conference say. I hope you've enjoyed this little discussion into this world of problems and topics and worldviews. Do go back over it and watch the video and read the slides. There's a lot in this. There's a lot of things about how we perceive reality and how science takes different viewpoints. But I think if we can actually use the basic, like Jung's core ideas of typology, we can bring a balance to this. We can bring some kind of way to transcend like scientific viewpoints to one that will actually reconcile and bring us to another level in the next century, hopefully, in another 100 years, when we're not having these arguments. So thanks for listening. I'd like to invite Sarah.
Thank you very much indeed, Richard. That was fascinating and a really fabulous start to the conference. That was really interesting. So as we said earlier, there are we've got half an hour before the next session starts. I'm now going to stop recording